When I met Julian Hunt a couple of weeks ago, in the equally grandiose circumstances of the House of Lords, he said, could you please give a practitioner's perspective on how systems thinking, what the value of systems thinking is inside of a large corporation. So being a dutiful corporate guy, this is what I will do. Having spent the last 11 years in Shell, I will draw many of my examples from there. One of the points which I think several speakers have made, that actually systems thinking, in my view, isn't that much about thinking. It's probably more about systems conversation. And in order to illustrate that, let me take you to tell you a little bit of a story which takes place in the Niger Delta. How many people have been in the Niger Delta here? Hooray. Yes, well. An interesting place to visit, you'll undoubtedly agree. I was there several years ago as part of a stakeholder engagement workshop that this local Shell company there ran, and you have to imagine an event with 500 people, and there were local politicians and village kings with bowler hats and silver canes, and this is a highly colorful event. And the idea was to engage on the role and the interface between the activities of the oil company and the local population. And I witnessed a little bit of a vignette which I'd like to tell you about. There was in one of the breakout sessions, there was a conversation between a village king, and there are many of them. Kings are not as rare as they are in Belgium, and a Shell engineer. And the village king was telling him that, you know, ever since Shell had put up this flare, these are serious flares, they're 20-meter high flames where they burn off methane, next to his village, that the water had become contaminated. And, you know, the engineer said, well, you know, that's very interesting, but, you know, you have to realize you burn methane, it's pure CO2 and H2O, so it cannot, it doesn't, in the engineer's world, this doesn't make sense. And the village king insisted and said, you don't understand, ever since this flare was put in place. And the interesting thing is you could see the frame of this engineer shifting as he engaged in this conversation. And he said, actually, I will come to your village and we will jointly investigate and see what's going on, because clearly something was going on, and perhaps not, it had to do with the flares. The point of this is that actually, you know, understanding how systems work and engaging with that comes about through conversation with diverse people and that kind of interaction. So I'd like to cover three areas where I think systems thinking is important in large corporations. One of them is around sustainable development. I originally joined industry as a naive theoretical physicist, but intrigued by the narrative that people in companies would actually be motivated and work to make money. And as you find out once you're inside a corporation, that's actually not the case. We have a much more complex set of drivers, and this is true for corporations as a whole. Making money is important, but ultimately they're determined by their context. They have to make money to survive. But for me, that's what sustainable development is about. It's for corporations to figure out for their particular industry, their particular role, what their contribution to sustainable development is. And that's different for every single company, and it's also different from the overall agenda, but you can only find out through conversation with people. So did Toyota, with their introverted quality culture and their laudable zero emissions target, did they realize what perfect storm they were walking into when they surpassed the icon of American industry in the same year it was being nationalized? Those are system forces that corporations need to think through, but they're not easy to get at because they're quite outside your normal zone of comfort. When I was head of sustainable development for the Shell Group for several years, we published a thing called the Shell Report, which was, you know, the best attempt at trying to summarize this interface, at trying to list what was all happening between the company and society and the environment. And it was widely scrutinized, but I always believed that its biggest influence may have been as a tool for defining the culture of the company itself, because in a sense it worked like a mirror where people said, oh, is that us? Are those the issues that we need to think about? So in that sense, it was a tool that helped employees think in a bigger frame than the ones that they faced in their daily job. At the level, the second point is at the level of strategy. Shell, of course, is famous for its scenario planning methodology, which it's been doing for 40 years, and that is the institutionalization of system thinking. It's the way to force, narrow, focused executives to occasionally step out and think with the future. The point of scenario planning is not to predict the future, because you can't, you'll always be wrong. The point is to think with the future, is to imagine stories about the future, and particularly and importantly to imagine stories of multiple futures, and then think back and force yourself to articulate how they influence the decisions that you make today. So for example, the most recent set of energy scenarios, since we're talking about energy, that Shell developed were called Blueprint and Scramble. And one paints a messy world where ad hoc coalitions of interest manage to coordinate their agendas in a messy way, but overall they progress in a policy sense. The second scenario, called Scramble, on the other hand, policy develops much more as on an ad hoc basis as a result of the Brownian motion of the actors in civil society. This doesn't do justice to the rich set of stories, but it gives you an impression that this is not about predicting the future. It's just painting stories about the dynamics in society that